Hello dear Motorsport-Magazin.com friends and Formula One fans. It was clear pretty early on that the 2024 silly season for the 2025 grid was going to be pretty crazy. Based on the number of expiring contracts alone, it was clear that the summer would be really cool as far as the driver market was concerned, but then it looked a bit boring at first. Early and long-term contract extensions Lewis Hamilton has already signed with Mercedes, and Russell has also signed on until the end of 2025. At McLaren, Lando Norris and Oscar Piastri have signed long-term extensions. The same goes for Charles Leclerc at Ferrari. Then the big surprise at the beginning of the year came. Lewis Hamilton will not fulfill his contract with Mercedes, making use of a clause that lets him out early. He switches from Mercedes to Ferrari, and anyone who thought that would have been the big bombshell was astonished when the news came that Max Verstappen was not safe at all with Red Bull. Max Verstappen had actually signed with Red Bull until 2023, but at the beginning of the year he added another 5 years on top of that, so until the end of 2028. Since then, Max Verstappen has won everything there is to win, and yet I wrote a question mark on our whiteboard at Red Bull, because it is no longer as certain as it first seemed. We have written the driver pairings for 2025 on this whiteboard. All those that are fixed are already there, and all those that are not fixed are marked with a question mark. But why is there a question mark next to Max Verstappen? You have no doubt noticed what is going on internally at Red Bull Racing. The affair surrounding Red Bull team boss Christian Horner is taking on dimensions that were not even thought possible at the beginning of the season. But it has gone so far that we now know that there are exit clauses for Max Verstappen from his contract until 2028. Performance clauses are quite common in Formula One. No contract is so watertight that you can't get out of it, but a performance clause is currently rather unlikely at Red Bull. Then there is also supposed to be an engine clause, where he is supposed to have a works engine, which he currently has from Honda. Then later he will have their own Red Bull engine. But there also seems to be a clause that is tied to personnel at Red Bull Racing. And Dr. Helmut Marko obviously plays a very, very big role in this. Max Verstappen revealed to us last weekend that Dr. Helmut Marko may not only play a major role for him contractually, but also personally. He was very important in his decision-making process, and he will also be very important in the future. Red Bull Racing has been given a bit of a gun to the chest. Either Dr. Helmut Marko stays or I leave too. So that was a clear announcement from Max Verstappen. And that is why it's now really interesting to see what's happening on the driver market with Max Verstappen. First of all, after Lewis Hamilton's move, it looked as if Mercedes was the cockpit to be filled. As if Toto Wolff would have to make a decision, and then the dominoes would fall on the driver market for the 2025 season. But no, that has now turned 180 degrees. It is now Max Verstappen who has to make that decision, or the power struggle that has to be sorted out at Red Bull Racing. If the Max Verstappen decision is then made, let us take a look at what could happen then. The first port of call for Max Verstappen, if things come to an end at Red Bull Racing, would of course be Mercedes. Toto Wolff is already publicly flirting with Max Verstappen. I'm going to draw this question mark from Red Bull Racing here with the arrow. Of course, this question mark is only free because Lewis Hamilton has changed. Lewis Hamilton also graces the cover of our new print edition, number 95, and he already adorns it in red. We take a look ahead in this print edition. Lewis Hamilton and Ferrari, can it work? How will it all develop? If you haven't got it yet, abo.motorsport-magazin.com. So let's assume that if Max Verstappen leaves Red Bull Racing, he would go to Mercedes. What would that mean for the driver market? We would still have two question marks here at Red Bull. That means there are two cockpits to fill. Of course, Sergio Perez, who is currently still driving for Red Bull Racing. His contract is coming to an end, so he will have a much better chance. So far, he has done quite well anyway. Daniel Ricciardo, for example, who is eyeing this cockpit, hasn't really done any advertising on his own behalf so far this season. But how are you going to fill the gap that Max Verstappen would leave behind? Now you could say that's completely impossible. Yes, I think many people agree on that, but then a very interesting constellation comes into play. Because then we assume that if Max Verstappen leaves Red Bull Racing, that Christian Horner has won the power struggle, that the ties will have more and more influence, more and more power at Red Bull Racing. And then the personnel issue of Alexander Albon could become interesting. He is Thai. He was once with Red Bull. He actually still has a Williams contract up to and including 2025, as team boss James Vowles has made clear. But it is also clear that if Red Bull want Albon, they will leave no stone unturned, including financially, and will then bring the Thai back into their own team. He has actually driven for Red Bull Racing before, was given a brief opportunity but didn't take it back then. But replacing the caliber of Max Verstappen, as we've just said, is probably impossible, especially when you look at which other drivers are still tied up here. The really big ones are gone. The only thing you could perhaps still say is Aston Martin, that question mark, that's Fernando Alonso, that he might still be brought to Red Bull. Then at some point, this marriage between Alonso and Red Bull, which people thought would never happen again, would come about. Another interesting point might be Sebastian Vettel. Sebastian Vettel has a long Red Bull past, having won all 4 World Championship titles with Red Bull Racing. But whether he could do so well with Christian Horner, there were rumors that he wasn't quite happy there back then, and that's one of the reasons he left for Scuderia Ferrari. Sebastian Vettel, would he still be interested in Formula One? He gave a very interesting interview in the NZZ, and he said in it that there are no direct plans as yet. That sounds a lot like politics and leaving all doors open. The colleague then asked whether that was a clear no, and he said no, it wasn't a clear no, not a clear yes, not a clear no, but it is at least somehow conceivable that Sebastian Vettel will come back. And that brings us to the next case. If we say Max Verstappen stays with Red Bull Racing after all, fulfills his contract, what happens then? Then, of course, the first move is clearly back to Mercedes. We have discussed this cockpit at length in recent weeks. Who will follow after Lewis Hamilton leaves? George Russell is already fixed, but that's definitely the case if we assume Max Verstappen at Red Bull Racing. The most interesting cockpit. What is happening here? Andrea Kimi Antonelli, the Mercedes junior driver, has often been mentioned, which is also one reason why Mercedes wants to take their time. They first have to see how he performs in Formula 2. The first race weekend for Antonelli was in Bahrain, where his team Prema was not competitive at all. Because of that, we have to leave that one out of the equation. His teammate Oliver Behrman also had a very difficult time in Bahrain. There was nothing to be gained for the Prem team, but now in Jeddah, Prema's car ran much better. Oliver Behrman promptly took pole. Antonelli, his teammate, was okay for a rookie. He was 6th in qualifying, 6th in the sprint, and 6th in the main race. Those are decent results for a rookie. But of course, it wasn't earth-shattering, and he actually has to be earth-shattering if he wants to drive for the Mercedes Works team in your rookie season. Who else is in the draw? Carlos Sainz, of course. He was kicked out of Ferrari for Lewis Hamilton. Of course, this is an interesting personnel matter for Mercedes. They could definitely gain experience with Sainz. And we must not forget that he was the only non-Red Bull Racing race winner of the 2023 season. The one race he drove before he got the physical complaints was actually quite decent from Carlos Sainz. Then, of course, there's also the Fernando Alonso personnel who could be linked to Mercedes. Toto Wolff has already said that he's not ruling anything out. Even when I asked him explicitly about Fernando Alonso, Alexander Albon, perhaps Mercedes wants to take money in hand and detach him from the Williams customer team. The Williams customer team could perhaps not only get money in return, but also more up-to-date gearboxes or whatever. So nothing is unthinkable. And then Sebastian Vettel has already been linked with a comeback at Mercedes. Of course, we have to mention him at this point. If you're still interested in the Mercedes topic, you can also take a look at our talk channel. We've already discussed it a lot there. And I'll tell you why you should watch this talk channel at the end of the video. Now we have illustrated the two scenarios. What happens if Max Verstappen stays at Red Bull? What happens if Max Verstappen switches? We would then assume that he would switch to Mercedes. Aston Martin has also been mentioned by one or two others, but I think it's more of a political matter that this is now in the media. Perhaps they want to put a bit of pressure on Fernando Alonso to extend his contract with Aston Martin. Because Aston Martin has made it quite clear that they want Fernando Alonso. But Alonso has said that he first has to decide whether he wants to continue at all. Then Aston Martin will be his first point of contact. But I think with these options that are opening up, it's obviously very lucrative for Fernando Alonso. Let's take a look at what else could be going on in the driver market. As you can see, there are already quite a few fixed points at the top. The further down you go, the more question marks there are. Alpine, Esteban Ocon and Pierre Gasly, both contracts are coming to an end. Neither driver is particularly happy with Alpine. And this is not only due to the current situation. We have already heard that they are looking elsewhere. Williams is actually set with Alexander Albon. We've already talked about him. The second cockpit, Logan Sargent, I think it will be very, very tight for him. The Racing Bulls with Yuki Tsunoda and Daniel Ricciardo obviously depend heavily on what happens at Red Bull Racing, how Christian Horner can extend his power there, or whether it is restricted or removed altogether. In any case, Daniel Ricciardo has not been doing much self-promotion so far. Sauber, relatively disappointing in terms of performance. Sauber is not 100% satisfied with the two drivers. Valtteri Bottas was brought to Sauber, and Andreas Seidel was also brought to the team by Fred Vasseur. Signed for 3 years back then. They probably would have liked to have got rid of him a year earlier. So I'm pretty sure that there are 2 cockpits to be filled, because Guan Yu Zhou, of course, also brings a lot of money with him. In the future, Sauber will become the Audi Works team, and then a paid driver will no longer be allowed to play a role at all. So that could be a very, very interesting team, a very interesting cockpit. Not in the short term, but at least in the medium term from 2026. And then we come to Haas, Kevin Magnussen, and Nico Hülkenberg. Nico Hülkenberg is a driver who is also often associated with this Audi Works cockpit. So that could be an interesting story. Of course, Carlos Sainz is also repeatedly linked to it. Whether he will do it in the short term remains to be seen. And then, of course, there's the question of how Kevin Magnussen's career will continue. He hasn't really distinguished himself in the last year and a half. Ollie Behrman, the most interesting personnel development in recent weeks, made a great debut at Ferrari, is a Ferrari junior. Haas is a Ferrari customer. So that's conceivable. But you see, there are many question marks also above. And if you want to know what that looks like in detail, you can head over to our talk channel, Motorsport-Magazin Talk. Then I'll be over there on the couch discussing with Stefan how the driver market could continue from 2024 to 2025, which scenario we think is the most realistic. Also, of course, everything to do with Max Verstappen, what we believe and what we think might even make sense for him personally. I think there will be 1 or 2 surprises.